Good evening, I'm Mike Rabel. I'm here to tell you today why you have never voted for president. You ask anybody on the street and they'll probably tell you. If you ask them who'd you vote for president, and they'll say, oh, well, I voted for John McCain. You may have people that say I voted for Barack Obama. Go back, people say they voted for Bush, they voted for Kerry. Unless they were one of the 538 presidential electors, they actually did not cast a ballot for the president. They may have done as expressed their preference, but they didn't actually vote for president. Under Article 2, the electoral system was a part of the Connecticut Compromise. Remember, you had Virginia representing the large states, New Jersey representing the small states. We use that term relatively loosely. And the Connecticut Compromise said, okay, here's what we're going to do to elect the president. We're going to give each state a number of electors, which will be equal to the number of people it has representing it in the House of Representatives and the number of senators it has. So, for instance, in Texas, we have 32 members of our House delegation. We have 2 senators. We have 34 electoral votes. California has 53 members of the House in their delegation, 2 senators. Every state gets 2 senators under Article 1. So they have 55. Those are the top 2. This is the year 2009. They're going to be doing a census next year. Those numbers will likely change. Texas will probably gain some states back east. I think Massachusetts is predicted to lose at least 1, maybe 2 votes. So the system was devised that each of the states would be granted a certain number of electors. How those electors are to vote is not specified in the Constitution. It's one of the few things that has still been left up to the states. There are about half the states that have actually passed laws that say whoever wins the popular vote, our electors must cast their votes for that person. So, for instance, and I'm not sure of this, but if in Nevada it said whoever wins the popular vote must have all our electoral votes, then there would be a statute requiring those electors from Nevada to reflect the popular vote. Some states, the other half, don't have any such legislation. Even if they do have such legislation, the way the Constitution is drafted, and this is one of those areas of federalism the federal government hadn't intervened in yet, the federal government probably would take a hands-off approach and allow the state to choose any means that it ultimately decided was appropriate for the state. There may be constitutionality arguments about that. If you remember the 2000 election between Gore and Bush, at that time, Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother, was the governor of Florida. And as the thing was dragging on in court and fights were taking place over hanging chads, dimpled chads, pregnant chads, Jeb Bush said, hey, I'm just going to call the legislature in session and we're going to pass a law that says our 25 or 27 electoral votes are going to George Bush. It's not entirely clear that there's anything wrong with that. And he probably would have been constitutionally empowered if the state actually went along, the legislature, and passed a law to do that, because it is unclear under the Constitution how those electors must be selected. That was, as I say, it's one of the last vestiges of federalism, but it's good. There are people that argue against it and say, well, it's not fair. You've got people, Bob won the popular vote, Bob should be the president. But the president was supposed to be, at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, the president of the United States, not the president of the people of the United States. In theory, he should represent the best interest of the 50 states. And granted, it would be nice if the popular vote were identical with the electoral vote, but there are times when that has not happened. There have been other problems with the Electoral College. The first problem came up in 1800 when it was determined that Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson both got 72 electoral votes, because you weren't required at that time to say whether you were voting for president or vice president. And in fact, the concept originally behind the Electoral College was that the person who got the most votes would be the president, and the person who got the second most votes would be vice president. The idea being, then your most qualified person selected by the electors would be president. If something happened to him, then the vice president would take over, the second most qualified. You can imagine what kind of problems this would have caused if, for instance, John Kennedy had been in office and Richard Nixon had been vice president, because he got the second most electoral votes. You want to talk about conspiracy theories, people would have been going nuts. But at any rate, the 12th Amendment dealt with that after the outcome of the 1800 election. There were other times in the past. In 1824, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but the House of Representatives, because it was not a majority in the Electoral College, ultimately chose John Quincy Adams in the 1824 election. In 1876, it was a very unique situation. It was Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes, who ultimately became the president. They established this independent commission, and the independent commission decided the outcome of the election. In 1888, we had Benjamin Harrison, who beat out the incumbent Grover Cleveland. Again, Cleveland got the popular vote, but Benjamin Harrison was able to carry the Electoral College. Grover Cleveland got his revenge as being the only president in American history to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. So I guess ultimately, whether or not you win the electoral vote, you still have a fighting chance to come back. In the recent past, the largest complaints about the Electoral College stem from the election of the year 2000, where Bush got 500,000 less popular votes than Al Gore, but he had enough electoral votes to get there, certainly with the result in Florida. The Electoral College, as I say, is really the last vestige of states' rights. You will occasionally have someone who doesn't vote in accordance with the way the state went. So, for instance, I think there was an Oregon elector who cast a vote for Al Gore instead of Kerry in 2004. Those people are called faithless electors. Faithless electors. They are casting a vote not in accordance with the popular vote of their state. But if there's no state law against it, there's nothing that constitutionally prohibits it. And so there have been a handful of times throughout history of the United States where that's happened. It's never been a sufficient number to throw the election. There have been calls to get rid of the Electoral College, but of course there are only 2 ways of amending the Constitution. One would be by a constitutional convention. It would be extraordinarily dangerous. It seems highly unlikely that that will ever be undertaken. The other is by having 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate pass a resolution and send it to the states, and having 3/4 of the states send back an affirmative response saying, yes, we want to amend the Constitution and abolish the Electoral College. There are at least 6 states that get disproportionate representation, states like Wyoming, that get 3 votes, even though they don't have statistically enough people to justify the 3 votes. So that the votes of the people in Wyoming count more than the votes of the people in Texas or in California, because they're statistically less of them. A ratio is less of them than there are in Texas. So there have been calls for it, but I believe there are enough states that would prevent the passage of a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, and I don't think there would ever be a call for a constitutional convention because it would open Pandora's box. Personally, I think the Electoral College is a wonderful process because it allows the states a way to still have a voice in the federal government. And as I said, it's one of the few vestiges of federalism that remains. It's a complicated process. It does have its problems. There are times when the popular vote has not reflected the electoral vote, but clearly the Founding Fathers had in mind someone who would be the President of the United States.